You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 27th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from Dufourstrasse in Zurich, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Ukraine is placed on a countrywide alert as Russia launches one of its most aggressive attacks since the start of the invasion. With the country's power grids targeted, we'll examine how the country keeps the lights on and the water flowing. Also coming up, North Korea continues to test its so-called suicide drones. We'll ask how Seoul is reacting to Pyongyang's latest moves, and
my mission in life was to allow other people to also become free in a sense. And using the platforms that I created, my hope was that they could express their freedoms.
Telegram says its CEO has nothing to hide, so why have the French authorities arrested him? And Juliet Linley is next to me, here to talk to us about some country rebranding in Trinidad and Tobago. Very good morning to you, Juliet.
Good morning, Emma. Yes, let's unpack this Twin Island Republic's decision to redesign its coat of arms in a bid to stamp out symbols of its colonial past. Is it possible to start rebranding an entire Caribbean nation, Emma?
I think we'll try in the next hour or so. We'll also get a fresh look for the new season as Monocle magazine hits the newsstands. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from Zurich. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. The US top general has said that the near-term risk of a broader war in the Middle East has eased after Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah exchanged fire this weekend. France's president has ruled out naming a prime minister from the leftist New Popular Front alliance. And South Korea is to open a new government ministry dedicated to demographic challenges after years of incentives have failed to increase the birth rate in the country. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Ukraine faced one of the most widespread and brutal air attacks yesterday as Russia launched around 200 missiles and drones across the country. Russia's defense ministry said the targets were what it called critical energy infrastructure facilities. And shortly after the attacks, there were reports of the water supply being cut off and power cuts across the country. Explosions were reported by authorities in at least 15 regions. Well, to tell us more and to talk about the power infrastructure implications of all this, I'm joined in the Zurich studio by Florian Egli, Senior Associate at Voraus, the Swiss foreign policy think tank, and Jenny Mathers joins me on the line from Aberystwyth. She's Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning, Emma.
Jenny, let me just begin with you. Ukraine is still militarily on a high alert this morning, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, the really lengthy and devastating attacks of yesterday morning have been now repeated today. And so, there's no respite for the people of Ukraine. It's really difficult for them after having suffered, quite so much. They're not even able to put the pieces back together again properly before, another wave of attacks has come.
Florian, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that yesterday it launched, and I'm quoting here, a massive precision-guided weapon strike on critical energy infrastructure facilities in Ukraine. What exactly do we know that was targeted?
Look, I think as always, it's very hard to get to verified information. So I wouldn't make a claim as to what we exactly know, which assets have been targeted. But we know, and this has been going on for, 2.5 years now. This is an extremely long and prolonged conflict already. What we know is that the Russian military has strategically targeted the energy infrastructure since day one, basically. And this is due to two factors, I would say. One is that, we've become so reliant on electricity mainly in our societies that, if you break down the electricity provision, you break down kind of civil life. And second is that Ukraine is reliant on a, I would say, like kind of Soviet-based energy system, which is very large, mostly thermal power plants, which are also quite easy targets in such attacks.
And Jenny, just looking at that when you have the private energy supplier saying that it's been ordered by Ukraine's national transmission system to impose emergency blackouts. And as Florian has just said, if you cut the electricity, you cut civil society. What is the immediate effect across Ukraine in terms of its ability to manage?
Well, I think at the moment it's hunkering down. It's dealing with rolling blackouts. It's dealing with, the water being cut out from time to time because, of the damage. And as soon as there's a respite, the civil workers get out and they start trying to repair things. But it's a constant sort of cat and mouse game that, as soon as Russia destroys something, the Ukrainians are trying to repair it, and then Russia comes back with another strike. So it's very demoralizing, I think, for the Ukrainians.
And Florian, you mentioned a moment ago the Ukrainian power infrastructure. I mean, I suspect that there are very few countries, in Europe at least, who design power systems, A, from scratch regularly, and B, with the knowledge that perhaps it could one day be targeted by an invasive nation. This Soviet-based system, how does it work, and how vulnerable does it leave Ukraine in terms of the way that it can be targeted so effectively yesterday by the Russians?
So we have been doing some research on the Ukrainian energy system, and I think one of the key factors is that you have large, mainly thermal and some nuclear power plants, and or hydro as well, and they're very concentrated. So basically, you have few targets, and if you hit one of these targets, and you don't need to destroy the entire power plant, but if you destroy its functionality, and that's what we've been seeing, because then afterwards they've been repaired. But if you destroy its functionality, you have a massive impact on the grid. And the second thing is that if you have central power generation, you also have quite central power lines. And what we've seen is oftentimes that the most devastating effects have been attacks on the interconnectors. So basically on grid connectors that connect, a region that is in need of power to a neighboring region that has a large thermal power plant. And so this exposure due to the centralization of the system is, I think, one of the critical bottlenecks, so to say, to attack. And now, of course, we've never built a power system to withstand attacks, I think. But in the discussion, and this discussion is already behind the scenes ongoing, how to eventually rebuild the Ukrainian energy system. That's a discussion that's been held, also in European capitals. This is a very pertinent question, like how do we rebuild it, if ever we rebuild it, and do we rebuild it in a more decentral way, such as to withstand potential future attacks better.
And Florian, staying with you for the moment, where can Ukraine now get its power from? I mean, how simple is it to ask the neighbours to help?
So ask the neighbors to help, I think, is pretty complicated. So Ukraine is connected to the European grid, but as far as I'm aware, it's connected to the European grid via one interconnector, and that's also the European grid. Amongst some European countries is quite poorly connected. So I mean that's a much larger problem. But that means we cannot just say okay, we'll just import electricity from elsewhere in Europe, maybe the North Sea if there's a lot of wind, and we have plenty of wind power generation in Denmark and northern Germany. That we just send that to Ukraine. So it is still pretty constrained to the Ukrainian territory, and that's also why there is so much emphasis on these repairs. And I would say there is at least on the household level a good reason, a good argument for a bit more independence. So for little things like solar panels that at least during the summer months will provide some electricity. But then of course the real critical thing is not now, but is in winter. When in a country like Ukraine you need heating, so basically for people to stay alive. And then it's much more critical if you talk about power outages and how to maintain a system where heat is more or less available to the population.
And this is the problem, isn't it, Jenny, that when you look at the way that Ukraine is having to keep itself heated, how its rooms are lit and how its water supply is maintained. We looked at last winter when Russian attacks severely damaged the infrastructure, and now the timing of Russia's attacks look that it's unlikely that things will be repaired before winter sets in.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is a real worry and clearly part of Russia's strategy. And the fact that in the city, so many people live in flats, makes it even more challenging to arrange alternative sources of energy and heating, whereas in the countryside, they can maybe have wood fires or get generators or whatever. So, yeah, it's a huge problem. And it's one that, the Ukrainians are really struggling with. And clearly Russia knows this. It's part of the plan to really make Ukraine suffer over the winter and try and break the morale of the society.
Let's move on now to talking about the arrest of the CEO of Telegram, Pavel Durov. He was detained this weekend at a Paris airport. The 39-year-old, cast as Russia's Mark Zuckerberg, says he has nothing to hide. Jenny, what's going on?
Pavel Durov is the founder and the owner of Telegram, which is a major global sort of social media site, messaging site, and it's widely used by a whole wide variety of people, from opposition, democracy proponents in places like Hong Kong and Iran and Russia and Belarus, to people who are interested in QAnon and cyber currencies and all kinds of different things. So it's a very big church. And Durov has claimed that he is a proponent of free speech. But what the French authorities are saying is that he actually has refused to follow, the guidelines, the rules, the law to prevent criminals basically from using Telegram. And these sort of criminals would include people interested in child pornography, people who are committing various kinds of fraud, and so on. And so the French are saying, well, actually this guy's responsible and he needs to be sort of held accountable for this. Others are saying, well, this is an attack on free speech. So it's a complicated and rather convoluted situation.
Florian, I'm not going to ask you to comment on the wider political implications of this, but just it's that interesting thing that the way that the world communicates now is now pretty much divided into silos, isn't it? And the existence of Telegram demonstrates just that.
So it's interesting. So we don't know at the moment, right, how political that is. So that goes from not political at all, which of course Emmanuel Macron says, to some commentators saying, there might be some political angle to this. And why we're uncertain about this is because, it is quite attractive, to access the communication of Telegram because it's so siloed, as you said. So we've built a system where, Chinese population communicates via WeChat, Western or US population communicates, via WhatsApp or by Meta, so a US company. And then you have Telegram that's very popular in Russia. So, and there's no interconnection between these. So I always use the analogy of email. So if you send an email from your Gmail account, to a Yahoo or a Hotmail or whatever account, then you would have to hack Google and Microsoft, to get both ends. But because we've created these siloed messengers, it's also much more attractive to kind of get in there. So I think there's a broader question of how we resolve this, because I think we need to be the information exchange across messengers and across therefore companies and empires, like economic empires, needs to be possible. And then maybe lastly, there's also an interesting political dimension to it. So Pavel Durov is a citizen, I believe, of Russia, United Arab Emirates, France, and St. Kitts and Nevis. So maybe that's the bridge to the later part of the program, to the Caribbean. But interesting, the Emiratis are now becoming involved diplomatically, and that's a story that I've only seen in Al Jazeera. And they're intervening with the French because they are reportedly saying, well, we basically provide consular services to our citizens, and we want to know now why he's held in Paris. And so there is a whole kind of international political dimension coming up because he holds passports of several countries that are in very different blocks, so to say.
Florian Egli, Senior Associate at Forage, thank you so much for joining me in the studio here in Zurich. And thanks also to Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at Aberystwyth University. You're listening to The Globalist live on Monocle Radio. The time in Pyongyang is 8:14 a.m. here in Zurich. Now, given the opportunity to launch a new weapon known as a suicide drone, which outfit would you wear? Leather coat? Dark suit? Well, for the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, the choice was simple. Wide cream-cropped trousers and a large floppy baker boy hat. Kim grinned as he was treated to a show of his new drones being deliberately guided into targets earlier this week. The targets then blew up. Well, to tell us a little bit more about what's going on, I'm joined now by John Everard, formerly the British ambassador to North Korea and a very regular voice around the table here on Monocle Radio. A very good morning to you, John.
Good morning.
Just explain to us, we have this, before we start even mentioning Kim's outfit, let's talk about this so-called suicide drone. What is it?
It's a drone that carries an explosive charge to a predetermined target and then blows up the charge and the drone, hence the term suicide drone. And the North Koreans claim that their drones can be preset to launch, find the target and explode without any further operator intervention. So they're saying they've got some quite advanced weapons there.
And just tell us how much of a development of advancement is this in terms of what North Korea's arsenal is?
It's fairly significant. They've developed all kinds of other weapons over recent months, but haven't done much on drones. These drones are not completely new. We first saw them in October 2021. They were displayed in an arms show way back then. And the North Koreans did use drones, 5 of them, to cross the DMZ into South Korea in December 2022, and the South Koreans were deeply embarrassed by not being able to stop this. They've taken a number of steps in the meantime to prevent a further drone incursion. But the North Koreans have not, in general, majored on drones. It looks like that's about to change.
And may we assume that Russia has helped here?
Possibly. It's very hard to prove that one way or the other. And one of the drones that the North Koreans fired off on Saturday looked very much like an Israeli drone. So maybe they catch one of those and reverse engineered. Maybe one day we'll find out.
Just explain to us a little bit about what the reaction in South Korea has been to this, because obviously when you have something as significant a development as you described there, John, the reaction from South Korea will be what? A sort of a stepping up of preparedness and indeed anxiety?
The South Korean government has moved very quickly to quell anxiety. The South Korean Ministry of Defense put out a very strong statement saying that they're fully prepared to counter any North Korean drone incursions, suggesting strongly that they've been working very hard since the December 2022 incursion to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. And they may well be right. Drones are not actually particularly difficult to stop. It's just you tend to face an awful lot of them. They tend to be used in swarms. So if the South Koreans have got sufficient anti-drone defences, they probably could stop a drone incursion. Worth remembering that in the Russian drone attack on Ukraine yesterday, they used over 200. So those are the kind of numbers that you're looking at for an effective attack.
And in terms of the wider methods of deterrence, there is reportedly a surge of support for a nuclear deterrent in South Korea as well. I mean, how much of a shift is that?
Surge of support is probably putting it a bit strongly. Opinions on this go up and down all the time in South Korea. And not surprisingly, the support for an independent South Korean nuclear deterrent rises as belief in the US nuclear umbrella falls. Now, at the moment, the United States has been going out of its way to reassure South Korea that if push ever came to shove, that the United States would, if necessary, press the button. We've had the Washington Declaration of Extended Deterrence just a year ago, and we've had the establishment of the Nuclear Consultative Group with South Korea, so that Washington is allowing South Korea to have some say in nuclear deployments affecting the Korean Peninsula. So I don't think we should get too excited about those who think that South Korea should have its own nuclear deterrent. Right now, they're quite definitely in a minority.
And in terms of the way that the United States is responding to all this, I mean, you talked about the support that the US offers. I mean, could the United States be relied upon in the long term to cover this?
That is a question that exercises a lot of South Koreans. I think the quick answer is that President Biden would almost certainly would. I mean, his commitment has been rock solid. Vice President Harris hasn't actually said so much on the campaign trail about the Korean Peninsula, but what little she has said suggests that she would follow in President Biden's footsteps. If Donald Trump is elected in November, however, I think all bets are off. Heaven knows what he'd do.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the line from London. That was John Everard, formerly British ambassador to North Korea. Still to come on today's programme.
Our covers can be complicated, and that's traditionally been the challenge that I've faced, is trying to simplify all the information and all the messages that we want to convey on the newsstand.
Look at a brand new way of approaching the cover of Monocle magazine in a little while. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
.21 here in Zurich, 7:21 a.m. in London, which is where we head now to have a look at today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me from Studio One is our producer, Vincent McAviney. A very good morning to you, Vinny. How's London looking today?
Good morning. Well, it's the hangover from a big bank holiday today. There was about 2 million people out at the Notting Hill Carnival, so I think there will be some sore heads going into offices.
And yours, fresh as a daisy, I assume, to go through the papers. What have you spotted?
Yeah, well, the first story that caught my eye was a piece in the Telegraph by Ben Wallace, who until very recently was a Conservative MP, and he was also our Defence Secretary for much of the Ukraine war. It's a really interesting reflection on how he found dealing with the Russians, but also with Western intelligence agencies. He says the real problem is that post-Iraq, intelligence experts really feel that they have to sort of copper bottom every piece of intelligence they give, that they think there has to be entirely factual basis. And that means that at times, particularly with characters like Vladimir Putin, you misread the people. You don't sort of judge the behavior correctly. You don't make the right psychological assessment. And he gives instances of the essays that Putin has written over recent years and how his warped view of history and Russia's place in it and what he believes the West has done to Russia really tells you that he is not someone out to build a sort of modern, prosperous economy for Russia, but he's out for simply revenge, that he wants to take his vengeance on particularly now the UK and France, which he sees as having mobilized Europe against his illegal invasion of Ukraine, and that the people around him also are driven by just this longing for a greater place in history.
And indeed, I mean, the last line of Ben Wallace's article is as clear as day. Make no mistake, Putin is coming for us. We must be prepared for the inevitable. And it's not often you see that sort of almost fatalistic line. And one is clearly assuming that this message is not necessarily just being directed at the Russian people or the British people, but at the new British government.
Yeah, I think so. Ben Wallace is quite a sober character as well. You know, he's ex-military himself, and he was seen as doing a pretty good job, probably the most proficient performer during the disastrous Rishi Sunak government. And what he's saying here is, we've already seen Russia's ability. I covered the Salisbury attacks back in 2018, where Russia used a lethal nerve agent in the city to take out a sort of defector. They also, of course, back in 2000s, Litvinenko, they have shown a willingness to, disrupt and cause problems in Britain. We know of other operations in the last 2 years where they've tried to sabotage supplies heading from Britain to Ukraine. And of course, we still don't really know from the French government what exactly happened to their TGV system just before the Olympics, whether or not that was Russian agents or whether it was sort of, the far left. That's never really been clarified. I think that's slightly telling that perhaps they think it was Russia, but they don't want to admit that.
Let's move on to a story in the New York Times, which is drawing parallels or sort of doing a compare and contrast between the Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris and the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, both public prosecutors, and indeed was Barack Obama was a lawyer as well, and they're sort of examining the characteristics of Starmer and Harris, and looking at whether there are other traits or traits in common which will point them towards a certain kind of style of leadership that we could expect from Harris and are expecting from Starmer.
Yeah, there's a long history when it comes to Labour in its modern era of connecting with the DNC. So back in the Blair days, when he became leader, he went out to Washington, had meetings with the Clinton team who had just won the 92 election, wanting to know what their secret sauce was. And that has carried on through the decades. I know Ed Miliband a few years ago, he was being advised by the Obama team. That didn't go so well for him. But what this article reflects on is the fact that this time round, it's actually the Labour team who went out to the DNC conference in Chicago last week to try to advise and guide the Democrats on how they ran their successful campaign. There are some differences. Labour here had a double-digit lead for about 18 months ahead of the election. Kamala Harris is very tight. But they're focusing on key things here. This message, as you say, Keir Starmer, interestingly, and Kamala Harris, both these public prosecutors, both going down the sort of law and order march. And we've seen Keir Starmer demonstrating that with the violence after the Stockport attack, and saying that, Miss Harris could potentially face, or the Vice President could potentially face a lot of disorder as well if she comes in, if President Trump's side loses, and how she'll need to respond to that. And prioritising that commitment to the rule of law is important. But they also warn that, the Kamala Harris and Keir Starmer have both shifted their positions and become harder on immigration. That is something that is critical here in the UK when you've got Nigel Farage on reform and his good friend Donald Trump in the US. But also something that they point out, which is really interesting, is that one of those who is very senior now in the Labour Party, but actually lost his seat, has travelled out and said he lost his seat because he didn't spot the signs. This is Jonathan Ashworth, who wasn't expected to lose his seat, but he didn't sort of get from the feedback on the doorsteps or the polling the strength of feeling in his constituency from the Muslim community and others about the war in Gaza. And this is something the Democrats really need to not be complacent about.
We have a little bit of time to deal with either NASA astronauts who are stranded in space until next year or Pablo Escobar's hippos. Which are you going to tell us about, Vinny? Your choice.
I'll very quickly do both. Two brilliant long reads. I Love a Space Story. Really fascinating tale in how these astronauts that went up for 8 days are going to spend 8 months floating around on the International Space Station. And also, critically, what it means for Boeing, having a disastrous time with its airplanes, now having trouble with its rockets as well, because these guys are going to have to come back with a SpaceX capsule, so more damage for them. And these cocaine hippos, now, they're not addicted to cocaine, but they are Pablo Escobar's hippos, because he had this menagerie in Colombia, and when he was killed, most of the animals were taken by police to zoos, but the hippos were deemed too dangerous. Now, several of them got out, and I didn't know this, but a female hippo can produce calves every 18 months. They can give birth 25 times during a lifespan of 50 years, and they think that from a group of maybe sort of 5 or 6 hippos, there are now roughly 200 hippos in Colombia. They are incredibly dangerous animals, obviously not native, they're sub-Saharan. But if they don't do something about them now, by 2040, there could be as many as 1,400 if the population is allowed to go unchecked. And they are terrifying. They are, I don't know if you've ever seen them in the wild, they are huge, powerful creatures, and they're responsible for a lot of deaths across Africa.
No wonder Mama Hippos are so short-tempered. Vincent McAviney, back in London, thank you so much for bringing us the newspaper review. The time here in Zurich is just nudging 8:29 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson, live from Dufourstrasse 90. A quick look now at the rest of today's headlines. The US top general has said that the near-term risk of a broader war in the Middle East has eased after Israel and Lebanon's Hezbollah exchanged fire this weekend. Air Force General C.Q. Brown, who's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, nonetheless warned that Iran still poses a significant danger as it weighs a strike on Israel. 5 Palestinians have been killed in an Israeli strike on the occupied West Bank. It happened in the Nur Shams refugee camp near to the city of Tulkarm. That's according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. France's president has ruled out naming a prime minister from the leftist New Popular Front alliance. Emmanuel Macron's office says he will instead start a new round of consultations with those parties to try to form a new government. And South Korea is to open a new ministry dedicated to demographic challenges after years of incentives have failed to increase the birth rate in the country. South Korea continues to break its own record for having the world's lowest birth rate, which hit a fresh low last year. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 8:30 here in Zurich. Now, Swisscom Broadcast has teamed up with the Finnish telecoms corporation Nokia to create a private drone network across Switzerland. Customers will be able to use the drones for inspecting buildings or infrastructure, to assess emergencies, and as airborne security guards. The so-called drone-in-a-box service, believed to be the first of its kind to be used across an entire country, will be available from the autumn. Now, Gorana Gergic is a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic security team at ETH Zurich Centre for Security Studies here in Zurich. A very good morning to you, Gorana.
Morning, Emma. Great to be here.
Good to have you around the microphone here at Dufourstrasse 90. I've just tried to briefly explain what drone in a box is, but could you just give us a bit more detail, flesh this out for us?
Well, the way that this technology is being pitched, and I have to say this is not the very first deal in Europe. Belgium already basically signed something similar as a deal with Nokia. This is basically being pitched essentially as a way to help primarily first responders in cases of emergency. It's going to help with infrastructure inspection. So basically getting some sort of video technology and thermal imaging technology up in the sky where, we can't necessarily access easily places to be the sort of eyes and ears and sort of provide a better perspective and provide some sort of situational awareness, mostly in cases when there is some sort of emergency or a crisis.
Tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned the fact that it's happened in Belgium, but this, I understand, is the first time that a whole country's adopted it. So how does the system work? Because you have to work out whose drones they are, who's in charge of operating them, and when you hire the drone, is it absolutely able for absolutely everybody to hire it? So if I wanted to have a drone patrolling my backyard, I could ring Swisscom and they'd send one over.
Well, the way that what I've read so far, and I think that this is a story that's just sort of been out there for the past couple of weeks, but certainly gained some momentum over the past couple of days. So far, the angle is much more on this sort of emergency response, public safety, rather than essentially, giving it sort of the air of it's a free-for-all and now all of a sudden there's going to be swarms of drones flying around. But I can see the appeal of that kind of, the sort of idea that now everyone and their dogs, so to speak, are going to be able to use it. But certainly it is something that has gotten a lot of civil liberties campaigners worried, because it does touch on some issues that are inherent to sort of debates that we've been having in the society around surveillance, right? Around the right to privacy and where these sort of drones could be deployed. And that's something to be sketched out, I think, over the weeks and months to come.
What do you think the reaction will be given the sort of the nature of the Swiss? Will they be happy to abide by rules and regulations, or will they like to prioritise a little bit of privacy?
Well, I think it all depends on the sort of regulations and constraints, the kind of regulatory framework around which this is going to be developing. So I think it's still very early days, and I think that there are rightfully some questions there, but I also think that in signing this deal, I think also Swisscom wouldn't have gone as far to kind of push outside of the sort of box, or, to push the envelope to the point where it would be something that would be unpalatable to the authorities.
One of the interesting elements of this is the choice of Nokia as a provider. Why do you think they've gone for the Finnish telecoms company?
Well, And this is sort of more in the sort of wheelhouse that I deal with. We have to understand that obviously living at a time of strategic competition, right, where we do have a sort of a global race between the superpowers, those that are more status quo and more revisionist ones, there is the kind of spillover onto the whole technology game. And of course, Nokia here is seen as a company that belongs more to the Western fold rather than, say, going with Huawei, which I think has proven very controversial in some of the deals that European countries were inking, in deals around deployment of 5G network over the past couple of years. And there is a sense that, if you want to de-risk, you need to do it as a whole of kind of society, economy kind of effort. And in that way, I don't think Nokia is particularly controversial, but rather that fits that kind of equation of going with more reliable sort of suppliers.
Regionally a safer pair of hands, you could say. And that plays into wider questions, doesn't it, about security. And, the fact that yesterday in the NZZ there was a whole assessment about how the Swiss intelligence service is in crisis. Arguably, it has a high turnover of staff. There are issues internally about the culture there. The head there is saying that they are, they're not as productive as they could be and not as good as they could be. And when you open up the wider issues of surveillance and security and sending out drones, how does that sit alongside Switzerland's more sort of national needs to keep things secure and safe?
Well, I think that this is a question that's not just unique to Switzerland at this point in time. I think that we, over the past at least, half a year plus, are dealing with these questions in general around, domestic safety and security. I think if we take a look at what's going on, of course, in the regions that are adjacent to us or just part of Europe, of course, the spillover of conflicts that we see in Ukraine or in the Middle East, this is all affecting security. And I think that kind of talk of, heightened threat risk in general affecting societies here in Europe, but more broadly, around the world is something that a lot of intelligence services, law enforcement in general are dealing with. And so in that sense, I think that the kind of story and the feature that you mentioned around under-resourcing is something that is a worry, again, given that for the past at least, a couple of years, but increasingly since October 7 last year, we've been talking about the heightened risk of, say, domestic terrorism events or extremism in general, on the rise, radicalization, and all of these things have to be taken with utmost seriousness.
Corona Gergich, thank you so much for joining us in the studio here in Zurich. You're listening to Monocle Radio with me, Emma Nelson, bringing you the Globalist, where the time here in Switzerland is 8:37 a.m. The time in St James is 2:37 a.m, 8:37 a.m. here in Zurich. Now, the coat of arms of Trinidad and Tobago is a splendid affair. Upon it, you will find national treasures such as hummingbirds, a palm tree, and a scarlet ibis, Trinidad's national bird. What you will also find in the centre, however, is slightly more problematic. The explorer Christopher Columbus's 3 ships, the Pinta, the Niña, and the Santa Maria. Well, now the island's coat of arms is to be redrawn to remove references to European colonisation. And I'm delighted to say that joining me around the desk here at Dufourstrasse 19 is Juliet Linley, journalist, broadcaster based here in Switzerland, but originally from Trinidad and Tobago. Very good morning to you, Juliet.
Very good morning to you, Emma.
Okay, so this is radio. So if you wouldn't mind, before we start getting into the nuts and bolts of the arguments, I've had a go at describing the coat of arms, but it is really quite a complicated thing. Could you tell us what it looks like, please?
Well, you did a pretty good job. So let me just add in that at the bottom of the coat of arms, we have
the Blue Caribbean Sea, and then the motto, together we aspire, together we achieve, and the coat of arms with the three ships that are at issue here. It's red, white and black, which are the colors of the Trinidad flag. The question is also, would you change the actual flag of the country? But we can get to that later. But just to make it clear, these three caravels, these three ships of Columbus are what are at stake, and they're going to be removed and replaced by the steel pan, which is the country's national instrument. It's the only percussion instrument said to have been invented in the 20th century because it's actually made from an oil drum.
And you have one in your house?
I do indeed.
Excellent. She really does. Just explain to us, so, I mean, after that brilliant explanation, it is clearly an incredibly busy coat of arms. And how do people actually genuinely feel about it now? Before we even start to change it, do people feel as if it is theirs, or are these three ships a perpetual problem that is always mentioned and discussed?
Well, it was Prime Minister Keith Rowley who actually made this declaration at the National Convention of the PNM, which is the ruling party in Trinidad and Tobago. And he said it's time to remove the colonial vestiges and replace it with a national identity symbol. Now, here's the thing. Where do you start and where do you end when you want to rebrand a country or retell its story or retell its history? So what do the people say? He said he wants to hold some public hearings, specifically on not just on this, but also on removing statues or symbols of colonialism. But who even will attend those hearings, Emma? Like, who goes to these? Let's talk about it. Is it people who are sort of pensioners, unemployed, who have time instead of going into work to go to a public hearing? Are you going to implement some sort of a direct democracy system, which Switzerland is so good at? Are you really going to be having referenda on all these issues? And then do we even look into reparations, which is perhaps a big issue that is not just in Trinidad, that we're talking about all over the world?
Let's talk a little bit about each of those subjects that you raise. And the idea there that, you know, the referenda, the consultation, this, that and the other, they don't come cheap. So is this being considered to be a good use of funds by the Prime Minister?
That's exactly the question that so many people were telling me when I was asking them about this over the last days. And they're saying, you know, if you do even just changing the coat of arms, you're changing the passports, you're changing the official seals, you're changing all the currency. So are you going to just do that all of a sudden, or are you just going to say, okay, from now on, new passports that are issued will now have the steel pan on it? It's a good question. And about branding, where do you start? And who should advise a country? There are no textbooks on, are you rebranding, or are you just getting rid of all the colonial vestiges? And what do you do? Bring in a branding agency, maybe like Wink, or like, you know, bring in Mr. Tyler Brûlé. And if so, do you then recreate, perhaps, if you're bringing in help from the outside, are you recreating that master-slave culture of dependency again?
It is a difficult one because we're seeing a divided amount of public opinion. I mean, the newspapers are covering that. Some people are saying that actually there are bigger things that you need to deal with. You know, there are people living behind the poverty line, and also, you know, people are concerned about the potential effect of people's knowledge of your own history. I mean, if you take the history of Columbus away from the coat of arms, you know, you're actually removing it from people's memory.
That's it. You can't erase history, can you? And the Caribbean is such a melting pot because of its history and because of its colonial past. So let's make sure that the youngsters of today in their textbooks, they are learning about what slavery involved and the injustices that were involved. But whether you are or you're not removing all the statues, that's another question.
And how does this fit into the wider issue of reparation, which has become an incredibly sensitive but widely discussed subject in the last few years?
Well, for the Prime Minister, it's a big deal. And he declared, no coincidence there, on African Emancipation Day, that reparations from the UK and other colonial powers would ensure that justice is being recognised by all and handed to those who deserve it. So he said in October, when the next CARICOM, that's the Community of Caribbean Nations, meet, then they're going to speak forcefully in unison as one voice and make a demand for that. So let's see what happens in a couple of months, Emma. Let's watch this space.
And Juliet, you will follow it for us, no doubt. Thank you so much to Juliet Lindley joining me around the table here at Dufourstrasse 90 in Zurich. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
to find out how we could help you.
Contact us at ubs.com.
It's time on Monocle Radio to talk art and culture with Emma Rose Abrams, arts journalist who joins me on the line from London. A very good morning to you, Emma Rose. How's London looking from where you are today?
London looks like it's actually going to be a gorgeous day today, Emma. But so fingers crossed that it stays that way.
Okay, everything crossed for us today. Let's talk about the art world and the latest developments. But first, a moment ago, we had Juliet Linley here in Zurich talking about how the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago wants to redraw or remove the Columbus 3 ships from the coat of arms, and it keys into something that you want to talk about as well, isn't it? About the British transatlantic slavery movement is suddenly becoming enormously focused on in the British capital.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like I think post our debates about memorials and kind of marking these events, coats of arms, all of these things being slightly redrawn and rethought. It's been announced that Caleb Brooks, who's an American artist, has won the commission for the London's Transatlantic Slavery Memorial, which will go outside the new London Museum Docklands. And it's going to be a large kind of cowrie shell, which is, it's got this kind of double meaning. It's a kind of beautiful little kind of white shell. But it's going to be a very large monument, and it's called the Wake, and it's meant to symbolise the fact that these shells were used as currency in the trade of people. But it also is a symbol of resistance, and that's going to be the memorial that we have in London.
And the location of it is actually in the heart of London's Docklands, which was transformed 30 years ago into a business hub, but previously before that was front and centre as well of the sort of the slavery trade at West India Quay.
Absolutely. It's a very charged location to have this memorial, but also very fitting because, as you say, this is where a lot of the shipbuilding, people, objects, currency, all of these things were coming in and out of East India Dock.
Tell us a little bit more about the background of this, because we have the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who has a diversity commission expressly sort of set up to do this. It's called the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, to draw people's attention publicly to complicated issues in the past. I mean, how successful an idea is that considered to be, knowing that in the last few years at least, and in the United Kingdom in particular, the relationship between the public space, the public, and Britain's colonial and slavery past is becoming incredibly difficult?
I feel like it's in its very emergent stages, and I feel like it's difficult to judge these things in the moment, even when these things are conceptualized, Bill. I feel like we only really kind of start to really understand monuments and memorials kind of a while after they've been up and people have had time to have them in their space, because they do exist in the public space. They're when we're walking to work, they're where we kind of spend our time. And so I think that's something, I think it takes time to really understand the impact of these projects. But I have to say, I don't think it's been that big a splash. I don't think there's been that much publicity around it. And I don't feel like there's it's really connected with the people in the way that I would have hoped that it would.
Let's move on to the Venice Film Festival. Its 81st iteration is just about to start. I'm assuming you'll either be going or following it incredibly closely, Emma Rose. What should we be looking at?
Well, yes, I will be going. I'm very excited. But I think we should be looking out for Beetlejuice. The new Beetlejuice film will open the festival, and everyone's very excited for this kind of redux, which looks like, it's the Tim Burton kind of classic. And it looks like it is remaining quite faithful with some of the original stars. It stars Jenna Ortega, who obviously stars as Wednesday in the popular Netflix drama, but it also has original star Winona Ryder. And so I think it will be very kind of a fun addition to the kind of roster. There's also Joker, Foliada, which will be starring Lady Gaga alongside Joaquin Phoenix, and I think everyone's very excited about that as well. Another kind of blockbuster, kind of which I think everyone will be very excited about, and probably will be quite a kind of slightly controversial but cartoony edition to the roster. But then there's also the adaptation of William Burroughs' Queer, starring Daniel Craig, which I think everybody's also going to be really looking out for that, and I imagine will be a kind of a very kind of interesting film, and kind of I'm looking forward to seeing how that is interpreted. Obviously, it's quite a big task to take on adapting that film, and then, yeah.
There's an interesting article in the New York Times over the last few days which talks about how the Venice Film Festival has become an Oscar launchpad. I think the opening line is, "These days the race for the Oscars starts in Venice." And the fact that it used to be, all eyes used to be on Toronto in terms of which films were lauded there, and it was paving the way for the Oscars ceremony. But now, because of a revamp of the whole festival, even, right down to the screening rooms, it has attracted Hollywood once again. I mean, is there that sense of excitement in Venice that actually it has claimed the European prize as the run up to the Oscars?
I think that there is, and you can just see from what's opening the festival. I mean, it's a big American film, and I would always used to look to Venice for something that was a bit, as it's an international film festival, like a bit more of an international kind of lens, and it does seem very US focused, which does turn the mind to the Oscars. Yes.
And how do you feel about that, given the fact that it is essentially a European film festival?
I do worry sometimes that there's less opportunity for us to really engage with the amazing kind of European films which are being made at the moment, and we can only really write about and publicise these films if we have access to them. So I hope that they do kind of keep that element of the festival going, even if they lead with the big American kind of blockbusters for hits, for the purpose, to draw attention to the festival, which does make sense.
Emma Rose, talk to me about Wu-Tang Clan and this incredibly rare album that we may all now hear.
Yeah, we may. I mean, we all remember when Wu-Tang Clan, had their Once Upon a Time in Shaolin album was released in 2015, and it was a conceptual album released in a conceptual way. They said, this is an artwork, there is one copy, and we will sell it as an artwork, in a kind of reference to Renaissance patronism. But unfortunately, it fell into the wrong hands after it was bought by Martin Shkreli, who ended up in prison for a scam related to AIDS medication, and had to then himself sell it again as part of his kind of penance. And then it's been bought again by kind of a collective called Pleaser DAO, who bought it from him for $4.75 million in 2021. He's uploaded it onto the net and said, well, I've actually got copies of this, and he uploaded it onto the net. But then they sued him and have reclaimed all the copies. So then we had a small chance to hear this album, which everybody wants to hear, and everybody's desperate to know what it sounds like. And they've taken it off the market again. So let's hope we can eventually hear this album, because the little clip that he leaked online sounded amazing.
Emma Rose Abrams, thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio, live from Zurich. The time here in Zurich is 8:52. And finally, where next? That's a headline of Monocle's September issue, our mobility special. To tell us more about the issue in general and about a completely redesigned cover in particular, let's hear from Richard Spencer-Powell.
It's caused a bit of a stir in the office, actually, the cover, in a good way. I've had lots of people come up to my desk and email me and compliment me on the cover. So that's normally, anecdotally, that's normally a good sign. We hope the public has the same response. But internally, it's been very successful. And I noticed on my way into the studio just now that at the front of desk, we have, as you know, we have a nice olive UBS unit, and we keep the out-facing covers on there. And I asked Millie on front of house, how come the new issue's been stacked too deep? And she said it's because so many people keep taking them that the display keeps getting emptied too frequently. So she's had to double stock it. But it's a very good, I say it's a very good cover. I'm very happy with the cover.
And I think it shows well on the newsstand. I was in Soho yesterday and I was like, very easy to spot. I like the color of the jumper of the model. We know the model a little bit, right? Especially you, right, Rich?
Yes, he's a very nice gentleman from Kyoto, I believe, named Taka. He's also an actor, and he's he's modelled for us 5 or 6 times now, and in fact he's been on a previous cover. But I think what marks the difference for this cover is that we've been very singular. As you know, Monocle is quite a complicated brand in the fact that we have lots of sections and we pack it forward with affairs and business and culture and design and travel and fashion. And often on the cover, you have to try and show as many of those facets as possible. So often we've been in a kind of composite world, or we might have a theme, but we also want to show our core pillars, as it were. So our covers can be complicated, and that's traditionally been the challenge that I've faced, is trying to simplify all the information and all the messages that we want to convey on the newsstand. But this time out, we just decided to be a little cleaner, and we've just got one headline, one cover line, and a little cell line and one image. And I think it's that clarity that people have responded to. And obviously when you go from being quite complicated to quite simple, it feels bold and it feels very new. In fact, lots of people have said to me, they like the redesign. But actually it's not redesigned.
We need to be clear here.
Yeah, be very clear. There's nothing new there, actually. It's just a slightly new approach, and it feels very new. But that point size, we've used it before. We've used the model before. And there's no actual design change to the structure of the actual cover design.
And how inviting as well. Where next? I mean, this is such a powerful kind of phrase in a way.
It is, and I think I've been lucky in my career that I've managed to travel quite a lot, and especially if you're doing something long haul or going somewhere new, there's always that moment when you're sat on the train, or you're sat in the lounge, or you're sat on your seat about to take off, and you're a bit hopeful. You're kind of excited about where you're going. Maybe you're returning somewhere that you really love. I always think traveling for work is a real privilege. Even though it's work, it's about Tyler mentioned something to me a long, long time ago where he said travel is about thirst for knowledge, and I think he's absolutely right. So I think that cover is quite hopeful, and even though the model has his hand on his chin and he's quite pensive, I like to think he's thinking about what may be.
That's a very good one. And Rich, let's talk about some other aspects. At the mobility special inside the magazine, I love the kind of stripy line, kind of white and red. That's a really good touch to it as well, and it makes it kind of very special. This is our special inside the magazine, right?
Yeah, well, I think, the chevrons, I think they just say travel, I think, more than any other sort of graphic symbol. And so we wanted to employ chevron. It's something we've been using over the years, but we just decided to go a bit more colourful with the blue and the red. It's a little bit airmail, maybe. But it's bold, and when you look at the foredge of the magazine, which is the opposite edge of the spine, you can see the colour. It brands it a little bit, and the reader can flick straight to it. So it just elevates it a little bit away from the other pages. And again, the editors have done a great job. It's packed full of really good stories.
Do you have a favorite one? I mean, I do love the illustrations of the small cars. There's a little article about some small cars around the world. I mean, this is super sweet.
It is dead cute. And I mean, not just the car designs, but I just think the way it's done, the consistency of side profile, and you realise how many micro cars are out there, which I think is a bit of an eye-opener. In terms of stories, I absolutely love the fashion story from where the cover image has come. Great photographer, Fritz, who...
Strong.
He's just very creative, shoots from the hip. And when I was going through, I just saw that image and just saw the cover. It was it's just a moment. And I think, when you know, it's a little bit like falling in love somehow. But then I also like this incredible expo story, which isn't transport related, but it's about this, I think it's Lithuanian choir conference or ceremony, and where all these choirs come together. And it's what Expo is meant to be. It's glorious, it's epic. You've never seen it. No one else has done it. We're using a new heavier weight gloss stock for this issue and the last, and it just absolutely sings. It's just, I can't wait to put it into frame it and put it on the wall or make a poster. But it's a real strong end to what I think is a very nice issue and return to autumn newsstands.
Rich, just finally, are you excited by the second half of the year? Because I'm sure we have a lot of plans, for the brand, new issues and specials and all sorts of things.
I am. I'm just back from my holiday in Menorca, and it feels a little bit of a distant memory because we're straight into a production week for our next issue of Confect. But I always like summer at Monocle because I think we celebrate the sun and optimism, but I also like winter as well because Tyler's such a festive fan, and I am too. And it's kind of like the business end of the year. It gets very, very busy. There's normally a little bit of spare sort of marketing money around, so there's a little bit more advertising work to do. and it just all piles on, and it's just like that race to the end of the year. It's quite buzzy, and I am looking forward to it. And there is a lot to do, so kind of watch this space.
And that was Monocle's Rich Powell in conversation with Fernando Augusto Pacheco. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio, and that's all the time we have for today's programme from Zurich. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Vincent McAviney, Chris Chermak and Anita Riotta. Our research was Monica Lillis, and our studio manager Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.